Mother bear was attacked by a wolf pack and waited to die. Then a miracle happened. The Nevada winter did not whisper its arrival. It screamed. Snow fell in heavy sheets, blurring the mountains into nothing more than white shadows. The wind tore across the wilderness like a wild thing, shrieking through the tall pines and driving the cold deep into the bones of the land. Somewhere between the hidden cliffs and frost-bitten valleys, a black bear stumbled forward. Her fur, once glossy and proud, now clung to her sides in frozen clumps matted with blood. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, each exhale forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. Spirit, they had called her, matriarch of the mountain bears, vanisher of trappers, mother of cubs who'd once tumbled behind her like shadows. But now there were no cubs. They were gone, taken by the wolves who had descended on her like a curse. She had fought, not to win, but to buy them time to escape. Her body bore the price of that battle, a hind leg nearly useless, deep gashes across her flank, ribs visible beneath her dense fur. Yet she moved, one step at a time, through knee-high snow that offered no mercy. She was not searching for safety anymore. Just shelter, just a final place to lie down and breathe her last without the howl of teeth in her ears. Miles away through the growing darkness and whirling snow, the beams of a jeep sliced through the storm. Behind the wheel, Dr. Ellie Morgan gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale from the cold and the strain. She'd left a ranch hours earlier after tending to a mare with a twisted gut, just a routine rural visit. But the snow had swept in fast, devouring the road signs, masking the tire tracks. Now she was somewhere she didn't recognize, following what she hoped was the old forestry road. Her eyes stung from the effort of focusing. Every few minutes she glanced at the gas gauge, nearly a quarter tank left. Enough, she hoped, to wait out the storm if she had to. Ellie had been in bad storms before. She'd grown up in Montana, for God's sake. But this one felt different, meaner, hungrier. She was just about to pull over and ride it out when something flashed in her headlights. She braked hard. A mound, a log? No. It moved. Ellie squinted, leaned forward. Her breath caught in her throat. A bear, a massive one, collapsed on the roadside, half buried in snow. Its chest heaved. Its side glistened dark with blood. Ellie sat frozen for a second, logic wrestling with instinct. A wild bear, wounded, alone. If it stirred, if it charged, there would be nowhere to run. But the bear didn't stir. It barely breathed. Ellie reached into the back seat for her tranquilizer kit. She didn't think, she moved, driven by the same compulsion that had made her quit the city 2 years ago, abandon the sterile clinic lights in the predictable days. She stepped into the cold, boots sinking in snow, the wind slashing her face. As she drew closer, she saw the bear's eyes open. Golden, wide, and weary. No growl, no terror, just exhaustion. And something else, something Ellie didn't understand until she was a breath away. Trust. Her heart thudded. Most wild animals feared humans. Some attacked. This one was waiting. Ellie knelt slowly, murmuring, "Hey, girl, I see you." Her voice trembled, not from fear but awe. "I won't let you die here." With practiced hands, she prepared a mild sedative. Not enough to drop the bear fully, just enough to ease her through to the next part. The bear made a low sound, something between a rumble and a breath, and Ellie froze, syringe hovering. But there was no resistance, just the rise and fall of shallow lungs. The injection slid beneath her skin. "It'll make you sleepy," Ellie whispered. "It'll help." Then came the impossible part, moving her. Spirit was a full-grown female, easily 400 pounds, dead weight. But Ellie had a winch. She had a tarp. She had desperation. It took her nearly an hour. Her fingers went numb. Her coat soaked through. Twice she had to stop and check the bear's pulse. Still alive. Still holding on. When she finally managed to roll her into the back of the Jeep, Ellie collapsed beside her, shivering. The inside of the vehicle was barely warmer than the outside, but it was shelter. She cranked the heat, covered the bear with every blanket she had, dug through her emergency kit for antibiotics, painkillers, gauze, and then she got to work. The wounds were deep. One in particular looked dangerously close to becoming septic. Ellie cleaned it with saline, holding her breath as the bear twitched. She whispered as she worked, about her old life, her mother's stubbornness, the fiancé she left behind. I thought this life would be quieter, she murmured, pressing a gauze pad against a deep gash. But here we are, you and me, in a blizzard. Spirit let out a breath, long and low. Her body trembled once, then stilled again. Ellie rested her hand on the bear's massive chest, feeling the slow rhythm of life still within. You're not just some animal, she whispered. You're something else. The storm raged around them. Winds howled like wolves in mourning. But inside that jeep, in the small space between a human and a dying bear, something ancient stirred. Ellie didn't sleep. Every time Spirit's breathing hitched, she was there. She adjusted her makeshift IV, held pressure on a reopened wound, whispered stories. At one point, around what must have been 3 a.m., Spirit made a sound. Not a growl, not pain, just a low, quiet hum. Ellie looked into her eyes and felt something unspoken pass between them. Not just survival, not just gratitude, recognition. When the storm finally began to ease, a pale light seeped through the fogged windows. Ellie rubbed the frost from the windshield and squinted. There, on the horizon, half a mile, maybe more. A structure, a cabin, smoke, it was hard to tell. But it was hope. Ellie looked at the bear. Her hand rested gently on the thick fur. I need to go, she said, her voice hoarse. But I'll come back, I promise. Oh, no. Spirit blinked slowly. Her breath misted the air. Ellie hesitated, then stepped out, the snow swallowing her up to her knees. The cold bit hard, but she pushed forward. Every step toward that cabin was fueled not just by need, but by a bond she never expected to find. She didn't know then what she would discover at the cabin or who would be waiting. All she knew was this: something greater than chance had brought her and Spirit together, and she wasn't about to let fate do the rest alone. Ellie's boots crunched through the snow with each labored step, the frigid air stabbing at her lungs as she forced herself toward the dark shape rising through the pale storm mist. Her legs were trembling, not just from exhaustion, but from the weight of what she was carrying inside her. Hope, fear, and the impossible responsibility of the life she'd left behind in the Jeep. The cabin looked abandoned at first, weather-beaten and snow-cloaked, a husk of weathered wood and shuttered windows. But then she saw the smoke, a thin, wavering column slipping from a metal chimney. She broke into a half-run, stumbling the last few feet until she could pound on the door with numb fists. Hello, she called, voice cracking. Please, someone's hurt. I need help. For a moment, nothing but silence answered. Then the door creaked open and a man stepped into the threshold. Tall, bearded, his face lined like old leather, he wore a heavy coat and eyes that had seen too many winters. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even speak at first. He just studied her, from her wind-burned face to her shaking hands, and then stepped aside. Get in, you're half frozen, he said, voice gravel thick. Tell me what happened. Ellie stepped inside, the warmth hitting her like a wave. Her legs buckled. She sank onto a nearby bench, chest heaving, every word dragging out of her like it had to be born in pain. There's a bear, she said. She's hurt, badly. I got her into my Jeep, but she's not going to make it much longer out there. She needs shelter. She needs care. I did what I could, but it's not enough. She looked up then, tears catching in the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but the unbearable weight of trying so hard to save something so big and wild and impossible. The man said nothing for a long moment. Then he grabbed a pair of snowshoes from the wall and pulled a thick canvas tarp from a trunk. How far? Half a mile, Ellie said. Back that way. Let's go, he said simply. She followed him into the storm again, and for the second time in 24 hours, Ellie found herself walking not towards safety, but towards something more important. The man introduced himself on the walk back as Jacob Blackwood, a conservationist who'd once worked with the state, but had long since retreated to the wilderness. You said a bear, he said, breath fogging the air. What kind? Black bear. Female, big, scars on her muzzle, her legs busted up bad. Jacob stopped walking. He turned, his eyes searching hers. You said scars, on the left side? Yes, Ellie said, confused. And 3 claw marks on her chest? Yes, she said. You've seen her before? Jacob nodded slowly. That's Spirit. Damn, I thought she was dead. Ellie's heart jumped. You know her? Everyone who's worked in bear conservation around here knows Spirit. She's a legend. She led her cubs out of a trap line 10 years ago, outsmarted 5 teams trying to tag her. There are stories. Rangers, trappers, even a few scientists claim she could vanish into thin air. She hasn't been seen in over a year. We all thought she was gone. But if she's alive, if it's really her, then that changes everything. By the time they reached the Jeep, the snow had begun to slow, the sky lightening to a pale blue beneath the storm's retreat. Ellie opened the back door and there she was, Spirit, still breathing, barely. Her massive body was still and dusted with frost, her breath so faint it almost didn't fog the air. Jacob approached slowly, removing a glove and laying a hand on the bear's head. It's her, he said softly. God, she's still fighting. With practiced efficiency, they wrapped her in the tarp, using ropes and sled hooks from Jacob's gear to pull her behind them across the snow. It took an hour, both of them working in silence except for Ellie's murmured encouragements. Hang on, girl, almost there, and Jacob's calm, methodical directions. When they finally slid her into the barn behind Jacob's cabin, it felt like arriving at the threshold between life and death, and choosing life. The barn was old but dry, lined with hay and insulated against the worst of the cold. They laid Spirit on a thick bed of straw and covered her with every blanket they could find. Jacob built a fire in the cast iron stove that hadn't burned in years, while Ellie unpacked her supplies, sorting through what little remained. We'll need more antibiotics, she said, and fluids. I had to improvise an IV, but it won't last long. Jacob rubbed his beard. We'll have to radio for a supply drop. Can't get into town with the roads closed. We don't have time to wait for airdrops, Ellie said, frustration thick in her voice. She's septic. Her leg might be necrotic. If I don't get it under control, we're going to lose her. For the next 12 hours, the barn became a battlefield. Ellie worked with feverish intensity, cleaning wounds, flushing infection, changing bandages, and applying pressure, when Spirit's shallow heartbeat began to waver. Jacob was there every moment, fetching water, heating blankets, rigging a better IV line. They spoke in low tones, often pausing to just watch her breathe. Spirit didn't fight. She didn't growl. She simply endured. She was still there beneath the pain, some piece of her still watching, still listening. Ellie whispered to her as she worked, You're safe now. You're not alone. I don't know why you didn't run when you saw me, but I'm not going anywhere. At some point, Ellie realized her hands were trembling, not from exhaustion, but from awe. She wasn't just treating an animal. She was standing at the edge of something ancient and sacred. Spirit wasn't just surviving. She was choosing to live. By dawn, the fever had broken. Spirit's breathing evened. Her eyes opened again, and this time they didn't drift. They locked onto Ellie's, steady and aware. Ellie sank down beside her, her eyes burning. You're going to make it, she whispered, her voice cracking. You're really going to make it. Jacob brought a thermos of coffee, handed it to Ellie without a word. They sat side by side in the straw, their shoulders touching lightly as the fire glowed. For a while, they didn't speak. They just watched her sleep, watched the gentle rise and fall of a chest that had defied death and storm alike. Jacob finally spoke. You did something impossible last night. Ellie shook her head. She did. I just didn't give up. Jacob smiled faintly. That's the trick, isn't it? Not giving up. Ellie looked at Spirit again. She's not just a bear, she said. I don't even think she's just an animal. There's something in her eyes. It's like she sees right through you. Jacob nodded. That's why we named her Spirit. She's more than wild. She's something else. Ellie leaned her head back against the barn wall, her body aching in every joint. Then I guess we keep fighting. Until she's back on her feet. Until she can go home. And in that quiet moment, as the barn warmed and the snow finally stopped falling, Ellie realized that home wasn't just a place. Sometimes home was a fire in the cold, a heartbeat in the silence, a stranger who didn't turn away, and a bond between two beings who, against all odds, had found each other when it mattered most. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of vigilance, care, and silent hope. Inside the old barn behind Jacob's cabin, Spirit hovered on the edge of recovery like a flame flickering in uncertain wind. The infection had receded, but the damage was profound. Her hind leg remained swollen and immobile, the tissue around the gashes still raw and angry. Ellie rarely left her side. Sleep came in fragments, often stolen in the straw beside Spirit's massive form. And even when her eyes closed, her mind raced through treatment plans, worst-case scenarios, and what supplies they might run out of next. Jacob became more than just a host. He was her partner in this strange, sacred fight. He kept the stove going, fetched water from the well when the pipes froze, constructed makeshift slings to support Spirit's leg, and shoveled out paths through the snow so they could access the radio tower up the ridge. From that tower, they managed to reach a backcountry supply depot. Over the scratchy transmission, Ellie convinced a pilot to make a medical drop despite the storm-wounded skies. When the first crate came parachuting into the clearing behind the cabin, Ellie sprinted through the snow to retrieve it like it held the cure for the world. Inside, fluids, antibiotics, more gauze, bandages, and, miracle of miracles, a better sedative mix and pain reliever strong enough to dull a grizzly's agony. Spirit began to respond more each day. First, with a low grumble that wasn't warning or protest, but something softer, an acknowledgement, maybe even comfort. Then her eyes began to follow Ellie across the room, tracking her like she understood the rhythm of her steps. She would sometimes press her nose into Ellie's hand when offered, a silent gesture that required no translation. When Ellie changed her bandages, Spirit no longer flinched. She simply breathed, steady and deep. By the second week, she attempted to stand. The first time, it was more collapse than movement. Her leg buckled, and she slumped hard into the straw, panting. Ellie crouched beside her immediately, speaking in a voice reserved for terrified colts and battered dogs. "It's okay," she whispered, brushing a hand down the slope of Spirit's massive neck. "We'll try again, when you're ready." Spirit blinked slowly, exhaling with a long huff. The next morning, she tried again. This time, she made it to 3 legs before crumpling. By the end of that week, she could lift herself into a sit, regal and still, like a queen reclaiming her throne. Jacob began building a gate across the barn's wide entryway so they could leave the doors open during warmer days without risking her escape. Not that they expected her to run. Spirit never even looked toward the woods beyond. Her world had become the barn, the fire's glow, and the soft murmur of Ellie's voice recounting stories of her childhood or dreams she once had and lost along the way. One night, Ellie told her about her brother, how he died young, how she'd run from grief straight into a life of sterile hospitals and concrete parking lots, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. "I thought I was saving animals," she said, her voice catching. "But sometimes it felt like I was just trying to save myself." Spirit rested her great head beside Ellie's feet and let out a low rumble, like thunder beneath the earth. Ellie smiled weakly. "Yeah," she murmured. "Me too." The blizzard's grip loosened slowly. Snowmelt dripped from the cabin's eaves like a ticking clock. One afternoon, Jacob returned from a supply run with a camera in hand. He set up a trail cam just outside the barn, angled toward the open field and the tree line beyond. "If she goes," he said, nodding toward Spirit, "we'll want to know where she heads. We owe her that." Ellie nodded. The thought of Spirit leaving, of that barn falling silent again, twisted something in her chest. She'd come here to survive a storm, but in doing so, she'd become a part of something larger than her grief, her past, her doubt. Spirit wasn't just healing. She was teaching Ellie how to come back from the brink, too. Weeks passed. Spirit's wounds closed. Those scars remained, long, dark ridges that caught the sunlight and told their story without words. Her leg, though permanently stiff, bore weight again. They began walking her outside in short intervals, first with the support of slings and later under her own strength. The first time she stepped into the snow on her own, Ellie watched from the fence, breath held. Spirit stood tall, inhaled deeply, and looked toward the forest, not with longing, not with fear, just readiness. When she turned her head to look back at Ellie, the message was clear. Not yet, but soon. Spring came like a sigh after a long-held breath. The fields softened. Birds returned. Trees shed their white burdens and stretched into new green. And Spirit, once nothing more than a bleeding shadow in the snow, stood now at the edge of the barnyard, powerful and whole. Ellie stood beside Jacob as they unlatched the gate for the final time. "She knows," Jacob said. She's always known." Spirit stepped forward slowly, the sun catching the gleam in her eyes. She paused at the threshold, looked back, and Ellie swore just for a moment. Those eyes held something deeper than instinct, something human. Then she turned and with deliberate steps disappeared into the trees. The silence left in her wake was deafening. Ellie stood there long after she was gone, wind rustling the early wildflowers, the scent of pine drifting in. "Think we'll ever see her again?" she asked. Jacob shrugged, smiling faintly. "If she wants us to." Days passed. Ellie returned to her rural rounds. Jacob to his quiet forest routines. The barn remained empty, the straw still bearing the weight of memories. Then one afternoon, as Ellie walked past the supply room in her clinic, she found a small envelope tucked beneath the door. Inside, a photo from Jacob's trail cam. It showed a bear standing tall in the forest clearing, her fur thick and black, sharp bright across her chest. Behind her, 3 smaller shapes emerged from the brush. Young bears, one slightly smaller than the rest. Cubs. One of them turned toward the camera, its face hauntingly familiar. Ellie's breath caught, her fingers trembled. She hung the photo in the clinic's front room, just beneath a wooden plaque she carved herself that now read, "Every life deserves a chance, even the wild ones." She looked at the image every day after that, and sometimes late at night when she locked the doors and turned out the lights, she would pause and whisper to the photo, to the wild, to the impossible story she'd lived. "Thank you for finding me too." The photograph hung in the clinic like a heartbeat, pulsing softly against the sterile walls, a quiet reminder of what had been saved and what had returned to the wilderness. Ellie passed it every morning, her gaze lingering for a breath longer than necessary, drawn not just to Spirit's massive form framed against the forest, but to the shadows behind her, to the young bears trailing after her like echoes of a lost promise. She'd studied the photo countless times, tracing the outlines of their shapes, wondering if those cubs had truly survived that terrible night. If fate, in one final act of grace, had looped time back on itself and given Spirit a second chance not just to live, but to lead again. Outside, the Nevada spring had unfolded like a flower blooming beneath snowmelt, quick, determined, defiant. Life returned to the high country in bursts of color and song. Rivers ran free again, swollen and laughing. Elk calves staggered through sunlit meadows. The land remembered how to breathe. Ellie threw herself into her work with renewed purpose. Horses with strained tendons, goats birthing triplets, a feral dog with a rusted collar embedded deep in its neck. She tended to them all with the same hands that had once pressed against a dying bear's flank in the heart of a blizzard. But no patient lingered in her soul quite like Spirit had. Some nights, when the clinic had fallen silent and the world outside dimmed into twilight, she'd find herself stepping onto her back porch, eyes scanning the distant tree line, heart aching in a way she couldn't name. Not sadness, not longing, just a sense that part of her still lived out there, moving through the pines on 4 legs, wrapped in fur and memory. Word of Spirit's return had spread quietly through the conservation community. Trail cams picked up scattered sightings across the protected wilderness. Wildlife biologists whispered theories, some believing it truly was Spirit, others dismissing it as myth reborn in another bear's body. But those who knew her, who had followed her legend and measured her by more than tracks in snow, knew the truth. One set of photos captured her leading cubs across a ravine once spanned by a poacher's snare line. Another showed her standing atop a ridge where illegal trappers had been driven out years earlier, her stance protective, proud. Jacob, still nestled deep in his cabin beneath Mount Blackthorn, sent regular updates to Ellie, always signed with a single line. She remembers. Ellie would smile each time, her heart swelling in quiet recognition. Spirit had returned not just to survive, but to claim the land that had once tried to kill her. It was as though nature itself had bent around her will, granting her a space to rise again. Not as prey, not as myth, but as matriarch once more. One particularly warm afternoon, Ellie received a call from Jacob. "You'll want to come up here," he said, his voice edged with something between reverence and disbelief. She came back. Ellie didn't hesitate. She packed a light bag, left a note for her assistant, and drove through the winding roads until the forest swallowed her. When she arrived at the cabin, the barn stood open, hay scattered from where the wind had played with old memories. Jacob met her with a quiet nod, then led her to the ridge overlooking the lower clearing. There, beneath the dappled light of a slowly setting sun, Spirit stood. Larger than she'd been before, her coat thick and rippling with health, her eyes bright and unafraid. Beside her were three younger bears, taller now, lean with youth, but they moved with the same wary grace she once had. As Ellie stepped forward, Spirit turned. Their eyes met across the distance. Ellie felt her breath catch, the world narrowing to that single gaze. Spirit didn't move, didn't flee. She simply looked, long and full, as if measuring the changes in the woman who had once lifted her from death's doorstep. Ellie took a tentative step closer. The younger bear stiffened, but Spirit let out a soft sound, low, guttural. Not a warning, not a growl, just a note of recognition. Ellie crouched slowly, heart pounding. "You made it," she whispered, unsure if Spirit could hear or if it even mattered. The old bear blinked once. Then with a turn so fluid it seemed born from the wind itself, she turned and led her young ones back into the trees. Ellie stood there long after they disappeared, the pine needles whispering above her, the scent of sun-warmed earth rich in her lungs. She didn't cry. The moment didn't ask for tears. It asked only for witness, for acknowledgement. Spirit had chosen to return not just to survive, but to remind them both what it meant to heal. Not perfectly, not without scars, but completely, all the same. That night, Jacob lit a fire and they sat by it in silence. No words needed, no explanations asked. Just two people and the warmth of something wild that had passed through them and kept going. In the weeks that followed, Ellie made arrangements to dedicate a section of her clinic to wildlife rehabilitation, something she'd always wanted but never had the courage to pursue. She called it the Spirit Wing. On its main wall, framed in reclaimed barnwood, hung the trail cam photo of Spirit with her cubs. Below it, a hand-carved inscription, "Every life deserves a chance, even the wild ones." People came, injured fawns, abandoned raccoons, a lynx cub caught in a barbed fence. And Ellie treated them all with the quiet tenacity she'd learned in that barn during the storm, the same strength that once sat beside a dying bear and refused to let go. Seasons turned, snow returned, then melted, then returned again. But Spirit was never seen in person again. Her prints appeared now and then near the old cabin, near the river bend where the salmon ran thick. Once, a single feathered pine cone was left on the barn steps, oddly arranged as if by some unseen hand. Jacob took a photo, sent it to Ellie with no message. She knew what it meant. A sign, a memory, a hello. Life went on quieter, fuller, deeper. Ellie still worked long hours, still whispered to the photo in the front room when the world grew heavy. "I saw you," she'd say, "and you saw me." And sometimes on windless nights, with the stars blazing like stories above the Nevada wilds, she'd step outside and listen, just in case the forest had one more breath to share. One more rumble of recognition waiting in the dark. Because some stories don't end when the page turns. Some stories live on in scars and paw prints, in firelight and silence, in the way a woman kneels in snow for something the world has forgotten how to love. Spirit wasn't just a bear. She was proof that survival is not enough, that the true miracle is to trust again, to walk back into the wild not as something broken, but as something whole. And Ellie Morgan, who once lost herself in the noise of machines and medicine, had remembered what it meant to be human, not because she saved a life, but because that life saved her back. He carries a frozen bear cub on his back, then opens the door and this happens. Snow fell like ash over Glasswell, a quiet, relentless hush that turned the streets to bone-white stillness in the heart of this frostbitten city where the winds howled like ghosts and windows shivered beneath layers of frost. Orion. Vance limped down a narrow alley behind the old train depot. The graffiti-streaked walls, rusted freight cars, and derelict loading docks were his chosen solitude. He moved like a man who had forgotten the sound of applause, the echo of a name once spoken with admiration. At 42, Orion was a relic of flame, once a firefighter, now a night shift mechanic with a ruined back, a limp that worsened each winter, and memories carved into him like smoke and drywall. He didn't mind the cold anymore, he was colder inside. His shift had ended 2 hours ago. The streets were empty, the air bitter. Every step down the icy back lane was met with the crunch of boots and the whisper of old pain. The depot had always been a place to breathe, a place where no one asked him how he was, where the world didn't try to fix what was already broken. But tonight the wind carried something new, a sound not of metal or wind, but of life. A whimper, faint, trembling. Real Orion stopped. The sound barely registered at first, but it persisted, threading through the storm, like a question begging for an answer. He turned slowly, his breath curling into the air. The snow clung to the rusted stairwell behind him, dusting the concrete beneath. He squinted through the blur of white, there barely visible beneath the staircase, something small and huddled. He stepped closer, cautious. Then he saw it, a bear cub, alone. Its fur was matted with soot and blood. Its left hind leg bent unnaturally, and patches of its coat had been burned away, leaving raw, puckered skin. The cub lifted its head weakly. Its eyes met Orion's, smoky, wild, and hollowed out by something it shouldn't have survived. But it didn't snarl, didn't run, it just watched him. Orion crouched, knees cracking beneath the motion, his joints a chorus of old injuries. He reached out slowly, murmuring something he couldn't remember saying. The cub flinched but didn't retreat. Carefully, Orion shrugged off his heavy coat, swaddled the shivering creature, and lifted it into his arms. The pain in his back roared to life, sharp and electric, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. Each step was a war. The snow dragged at his boots. His breath came in ragged clouds. The cub didn't move. It only whimpered once, a soft sound like splintered wood. He didn't stop until they reached the modest gray house at the end of the block, its porch light glowing like a half-remembered dream. Inside, the heat was barely holding against the cold. Orion laid the cub near the wood stove, stoked the embers until flames reached higher, then sank beside it. His hands moved instinctively, scissors slicing away burnt fur. Antiseptic dabbed onto raw-skinned strips of cloth turned into a splint. The cub whimpered but didn't resist. Orion worked in silence, his own breath loud in the quiet. Once the cub met his gaze, eyes rimmed with terror and fatigue. Orion held that look for a moment. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. Across the street, in the window of the weathered duplex, a teenager sat watching. 17-year-old Ren Miles, mute, since a fire took both his voice and his parents sketched what he saw with charcoal-streaked fingers. He didn't speak, hadn't in years, but his hands spoke fluently through art, through motion. Tonight he captured the bent figure of Orion wrapped in snow and shadow, carrying the broken cub like it was the last ember of a dying world. On the bottom of the page, he wrote one word: safe. The next morning, Orion opened his door to find June Miles standing there, bundled in a coat that looked like it had fought battles of its own. She had purple hair, a smirk that could defrost glass, and the kind of energy that didn't ask permission. So she said, stepping inside without waiting, "You picked up a bear." She carried a duffel bag full of gauze, antiseptic, and smoked fish-shaped treats. "I used to foster wildlife," she added, kneeling beside the stove. "Ren saw you last night. Good instincts, that boy. He knows broken when he sees it." Orion raised an eyebrow but said nothing. June examined the cub with practiced hands. "He's young, but this isn't a forest accident. These burns. Controlled, targeted. He's not just lost. He's been erased." Orion frowned. Erased, like someone wanted him to disappear. Not die, just not exist anymore. The words settled over the room like fresh snow. In the days that followed, Orion adjusted his world for Gus. That's what he named the cub, after an old dog from his childhood. Gus flinched at sirens barked in his sleep and trembled at crashing pans. Orion patted the windows, softened the lights, muffled the house like a man turning his pain into shelter. The cub began to trust him, not through tail wags or playful growls, but in the quiet ways: a slow blink, a head rested on Orion's boot, a sigh when the stove crackled warm. One night, a crash outside a toppled bin maybe sent Gus into a frenzy. He limped out through a gap in the fence before Orion could stop him. Panic rose like fire in Orion's spine. He grabbed his coat, ignored the lightning bolt in his back, and followed Gus's tracks into the storm. The snow was relentless, the cold sharp as razors, but he pressed on. Finally, beneath a concrete mixer in the industrial yard, he found Gus curled in a ball. whimpering. "Hey, Orion," whispered, dropping to his knees. "You're okay, I got you." He wrapped the cub in his coat again and collapsed beside him in the snow, the pain stealing his breath. They lay like that for a while, man and bear, broken and breaking, but still breathing. When morning came, a new sketch was taped to Orion's door. Wren's hand again, a charcoal drawing of a man and a bear curled in the snow, snowflakes falling around them like ashes. At the bottom, in thick, careful strokes, home. Orion stared at the drawing for a long time, the frost still clinging to the glass. Then he pressed it to his chest and whispered, "Yeah, home." The days that followed turned Glasgow into a monochrome world of steel and snow, where the only warmth lived inside a house that now pulsed with fragile life. Gus, the singed bear cub, with eyes like smoke and limbs held together by splints and quiet hope, had become more than a guest. In Orion Vance's life, he was a breath drawn after too long underwater. Each morning began the same Orion easing himself from the battered couch joints, stiff pain whispering through his back, only to find Gus curled near the wood stove, breath fogging the air in soft huffs. Sometimes the cub would lift his head, blink those heavy eyes, and let out a soft grunt, as if to say, "Still here," and Orion would nod in return, answering without words, "Me too." Across the street, Ren Miles watched with the intensity of someone who didn't just observe the world, but translated it. Every moment between the man and the bear became a sketch, a charcoal poem where silence held more meaning than dialogue. June had taken to stopping by every other day, always with a bag of supplies and a commentary that danced between sarcastic and sincere. "I swear," she muttered one evening, as she refilled Gus's water bowl with chamomile-infused ice melt. "He looks at you like you're his whole damn forest." Orion had merely grunted in reply, but in his heart he knew it was true. Gus's gaze was not one of dependency, it was memory, recognition, as if some forgotten part of him had been woken by fire and found its way to Orion's doorstep through ash and instinct. The change in Gus was slow, deliberate. At first he flinched at every clatter, retreated at the scrape of boots against tile, but Orion learned. He wrapped towels around the base of the stove to muffle its groans. He stopped using the microwave altogether when its beeping sent Gus into a frenzy. Instead, he boiled everything the old way, whispering to Gus in the lulls between the kettle's hiss and the fire's crackle. They settled into a rhythm, one wound around pain and patience, and still Ren sketched. He never knocked, never spoke, but his drawings kept appearing folded and tucked beneath Orion's door, or taped gently to the window with safe scrawled at the corner. One sketch showed Gus sleeping curled like a comma on the rug, Orion dozing beside him. One hand resting near the cub's paw, another caught a rare moment of play. Gus batting a scarf, Orion had carelessly dropped the man's faint smile visible through the blur of motion. But the most recent sketch changed everything. It came late one night, slipped under the door while Orion dozed. He unfolded it slowly, the paper soft at the edges from Ren's handling. The image was sharp, angrier than the rest. Gus, standing protectively in front of Orion. His small body, taut eyes narrowed, something unseen beyond the frame burning in the distance. Above the flames stood a man rigid in uniform, but his face was unmistakable. Orion staggered back a step. "Colton," he whispered. "Colton Verrill, once his fire captain. Now a polished executive at Tearshield Solutions, a private fire control consultancy with government contracts and blood-stained files." Orion hadn't spoken to Colton in years, not since the warehouse fire that killed half their unit and left Orion crawling through broken beams with a shattered back and a scream that never left his throat. The next morning brought more than frost on the window. Nose? A knock, sharp, deliberate, rattled the door. Gus growled low, a sound that vibrated in the floorboards. Orion opened the door slowly, his body shielding Gus's view. On the porch stood Detective Denzel Morrow, tall, dark-skinned, wrapped in a thick peacoat dusted with snow. His eyes were keen, tired but focused. "Mr. Vance," he said, nodding. "I'm here about the bear." Orion stiffened. "He's mine," he said automatically. Morrow held up a hand. "No one's taken him, not yet. I'm just here to talk." Over mugs of black coffee and the gentle rasp of Gus snoring near the stove, Morrow laid out the pieces. Gus wasn't just any bear cub. He matched the profile of a young companion animal trained under the Forest Ranger Division's Emberwatch program, a now-defunct unit that partnered animals with rangers to scout and detect early wildfires. Gus had been listed as missing after the program was shut down. The official story says the animals were reassigned or humanely retired, Morrow said. "But the paperwork's a mess." Too many vanishings and you're bare. He nodded toward Gus. He was erased intentionally. It all came rushing back then. The warehouse fire, the rushed decommissioning of the Ember Watch project, Colton's abrupt promotion to executive. Orion's lip curled. Colton signed the shutdown. Orders, didn't he? Morrow nodded. Tear Shield. Solutions absorbed Ember Watch assets shortly after. And Colton, he's the reason the records were buried, but Gus survived. Someone tried to kill him and he escaped. Orion's hands tightened around his mug. They'll come for him, won't they? Morrow didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small device. We think he has a tracking chip. Damaged but still there. If we extract it, we might get a serial number. Something concrete. Orion looked at Gus, who had lifted his head, eyes wide. Can he handle it? We'll be careful, Morrow promised. They took Gus to the municipal vet where Dr. Penelope Graves, a no-nonsense woman with steely hair and surgical hands, worked gently to find the chip. It was embedded deep in the scar tissue of his shoulder. When it finally emerged, she cleaned it and handed it over. Serial's intact, she said. It links to an Ember Watch roster. Gus' real name, Alpha 41, was paired with a ranger named Landon Tress, presumed dead in the same fire you survived. Orion's breath caught. Landon trained him, he whispered. Morrow nodded grimly. And someone made sure he didn't survive to testify back home. Orion stood with Gus curled at his feet, the world outside quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. That night he found another sketch from Wren, this one of Gus standing firm before a wall of fire, Orion behind him, a silhouette looming in the smoke. At the bottom, Wren had written 2 words in his blocky, careful hand. He remembers. 2 days later, Colton Verrill showed up in person. He arrived in a sleek black SUV flanked by 2 suited security men. His coat was tailored, his hair perfect, his smile so sharp it could have cut glass. Orion, he said, extending a gloved hand, heard you've been playing zookeeper. Orion didn't move. Gus stood beside him, hackles raised, trembling, not from fear but from something old with recognition. Colton's smile tightened. That's company property you have got there, just here to collect. Morrow appeared behind Orion, silent but present. That bear isn't property, he said coolly. And unless you've got a warrant, you're trespassing. Colton laughed. You really think some injured has-been and a traumatized bear can stop this? He took a step forward. Gus stepped between them, teeth bared. Orion put a hand on the cub's back. He's not yours anymore, he said quietly. He never was. Colton left, but the battle had begun. That evening, as snow blanketed the street in soft sheets of white, Wren's final drawing arrived larger than the others, folded in thick parchment. It was of Orion and Gus standing before a wall of flames, their backs straight, eyes forward. In the corner, signed in steady hand, still standing. And Orion knew then this wasn't just survival, it was testimony. He looked down at Gus, who blinked slowly up at him, then back to the drawing. We're not alone anymore, he whispered. And we're not backing down. The next morning brought more than frost on the windows. A knock broke the silence, firm and deliberate, unlike June's usual chaotic rhythm or Wren's ghost-like quiet. Orion opened the door to find a man wrapped in a long black coat, the collar turned high against the wind and a badge glinting from beneath the lapel. Detective Denzel Moreau. The man introduced himself, extending a hand that felt too steady for the storm around them. I'm following up on a missing animal report. You might have something or someone that belongs to the Ranger Division. Orion didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stepped aside and let the man in. Gus was near the stove as usual, head lifted, watching warily. Morrow froze at the sight of him. That's him, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. It's really him. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle the cub. You've been through hell, haven't you, kid? Gus shifted closer to Orion, eyes flicking between the 2 men. His name is Gus, Orion said at last. Found him under the depot stairwell a week ago, burned leg busted. You telling me he's not just a cub? Morrow stood and nodded. He's one of 5 trained bears that were part of the Wildfire Ranger Initiative 2 years ago, funded by the Forestry Defense Act, used for early smoke detection, terrain patrol, and in rare cases rescue. Gus was paired with a ranger named Nolan Keen unit, disbanded last year quietly. We lost track of all the animals after that, and I've been trying to figure out why. Ever since Orion leaned against the wall, his back aching more than usual. Disbanded? Why? Morrow's gaze darkened. Budget cuts. Politics. But there's more to it. The logs were scrubbed, tracking chips disabled. It's like someone wanted them to vanish. Gus let out a soft, wary growl, barely more than a hum. He's afraid of sirens, Orion said. Anything loud, doors slamming, boots. I've had to change half my routine just to keep him calm. Morrow nodded, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. I know the signs. I used to work K9 before joining homicide. Lost a military tracking bear in Afghanistan. Name was Roach. Took shrapnel, saving 2 medics. He didn't make it. You never forget the way they look at you, like they know more than they should. Silence fell between them, heavy and reverent. Gus inched forward and sniffed Morrow's coat. The detective didn't move. Then softly he said, I'll do what I can, but you need to be ready. If someone went to this much trouble to make Gus disappear, they're not going to be happy. He's been found 2 days later. Colton Verrill came knocking. No warning, no message, just the scrape of tires in the snow and a black SUV gleaming like oil outside Orion's house. The door opened before Orion could speak. Colton stepped inside like he still had rank, still had command, dressed in tailored wool and smelling faintly of cigars and power. You've got something that doesn't belong to you, he said, eyes cutting to Gus immediately. He's government property, and I'm here to reclaim him. Orion didn't answer. Gus stood his ground, body stiff, but he didn't hide. His gaze locked onto Colton's face and stayed there. Orion stepped between them. He's not yours, he said. Not anymore. You left him to burn. Colton's expression barely shifted. It was a failed program. Liability outweighed benefit. Nothing personal. But we've got investors now, and if the animal's still alive, he's part of an active contract. I can't let you keep him. Behind him, June's voice rang out sharp from the hallway. Funny, because the last time I checked, you don't own souls. Colton turned momentarily thrown. June appeared with Ren at her side. The boy clutched a sketch pad to his chest. Charcoal smudges streaked across his fingers like battle paint. This him, she asked Ren. Flip onto a drawing, Gus between flames standing over a fallen figure. Orion's silhouette behind him. Another showed Colton in a uniform walking away from fire. June translated the image without hesitation. He remembers who abandoned him and who didn't. Morrow arrived not long after, flanked by a woman in a gray coat and horn-rimmed glasses. Dr. Penelope Graves, he said. Municipal vet, we did a scan on Gus. She held up a tablet revealing the faint glow of a chip embedded in Gus's shoulder. It was partially deactivated. Deliberate interference, but the serial number matches a ranger log. Gus isn't a wild animal. He's a registered asset, one that disappeared during the Tear Shield acquisition. Colton scoffed. That proves nothing. The chip could have been stolen. Fake not with behavioral markers like these, Graves said coolly. He responds to smoke cues, knows how to navigate burning terrain. That's not instinct, that's training. A silence followed. Gus shifted closer to Orion again, brushing his shoulder against the man's leg. Morrow looked at Colton, an expression unreadable. You want to go to court over this? Fine, but you'd better have more than boardroom bravado and a contract, because I've got logs, witnesses, and a bear that reacts to the sound of a fire bell like it's a command. Colton's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He left without slamming the door. That was his last attempt to intimidate. It wouldn't be the last move, but it was the last time he would see Gus without a fight. In the weeks that followed, the case built itself. Morrow pulled sealed memos. Graves provided footage of Gus during stress testing, footage that matched his behaviors now. June dug up financial reports, and Ren drew. Each piece of art told a truth that words couldn't. The final one, left on the judge's bench this morning of the hearing, was simple. Orion standing amid scorched trees, Gus beside him. Both battered, both upright. At the bottom, 2 words etched in bold strokes. Still standing, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, animal rights advocates, a few off-duty firefighters who remembered the blaze that broke Orion's back and nearly took his life. Orion stood with Morrow and Graves beside him. Colton sat on the opposing bench, lawyers whispering in his ear. Judge Eliza Monroe presided, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for seeing past polished lies. Testimonies were given. The chip was confirmed, Gus's trauma responses detailed. Ren's art submitted with June's interpretations. And when Orion finally spoke, voice raw but steady, the room held its breath. He saved me, he said simply. Not in a dramatic way. Not from a fire, just from being alone in a world that forgot how to care. Judge Monroe took one long look at Gus, who had sat quietly near Orion's chair the entire time, a steady tail tucked but calm. Then she spoke. I find no legal basis to classify this animal as recoverable property and more than sufficient cause to consider his well-being compromised by any forced reassignment. Custody is granted to Mr. Orion Vance. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into Tear Shield Solutions and the termination of the Ranger Initiative. Outside snow was falling again, lighter now, more like a hush than a burden. Wren stood beside Orion's sketchbook at his side. June lit a cigarette with fingers that shook slightly from adrenaline. Gus nosed at Orion's coat, then turned to look at them all, as if taking count, as if marking the ones who stayed. Wren raised his hand slowly, and with careful fingers he signed, "He is family." Orion reached out, placed a hand on Wren's shoulder, and said softly, "So are we." By the river where the frost still clung to the stones, and the wind whispered over the water like breath through broken lungs, they stood together. Four survivors, a man bent but not broken, a boy who spoke through ash and paper, a woman who never stopped believing in wild things, and a bear who had walked through fire and found his way home. And Gus always looking back to make sure the ones who mattered were still behind him. Not from fear, but from faith, spring arrived slowly in Glaswell, reluctant and pale, melting the snow in small hesitations, one rooftop and gutter at a time. The city, still dusted in gray and rust, began to shift beneath the lingering frost, like something waking from a long, hard sleep. Orion Vance stood at the back of his property where the snow had finally receded enough to reveal the broken fence Gus had bolted through all those weeks ago. He knelt in the thawed soil, a hammer in one hand, and slowly realigned the shattered slat now worn smooth at the edges by time and cold. Gus was beside him, larger now, thicker through the shoulders, his once burned fur grown in patches of dark caramel. The legs still limped, but less so. His body had healed in places his heart never stopped guarding, but the fear that had once owned him had loosened its grip, replaced by something else. Trust. Gus nosed the hammer at one point, nudging it from Orion's fingers as if to say, "You don't need to fix everything." Orion chuckled under his breath, a sound that surprised even him. There had been a time not so long ago when he never laughed, when the world was just ash and survival. But that time had passed like the last storm of winter. Not without scars, not without ache, but it had passed. Wren. Miles sat cross-legged on the porch steps, sketchbook in his lap, charcoal dusting his fingers. He drew slowly now, no longer with desperation but with calm precision. The silence that had once wrapped him like a cage now felt more like a blanket, something soft and chosen. Every drawing was a page in a journal of survival, not just his but Gus's, Orion's, June's. The most recent one showed all four of them beneath a tree that hadn't grown yet, its trunk bare branches empty, but in the image, each figure held something glowing. Light, warmth, fire, but not the destructive kind. The kind you build homes around. Wren didn't speak with words, still, but he spoke with presence, and Orion had learned to hear it. When Wren tapped the edge of his page twice and nodded toward Orion, the man understood. "You belong in this. You're part of the picture." June arrived moments later, her motorcycle coughing, smoke into the warming air, her coat billowing like a worn-out flag. She stepped off, pulling her goggles down and ruffling Wren's hair, before marching straight over to Gus with a bag of treats shaped like fish and honeycombs. "Tell me that bear hasn't been getting lazy," she said, tossing one toward the porch. Gus snatched it midair with a satisfying chomp. "He's got me running laps," Orion said, flexing his back with a wince. "Tried to follow a squirrel 2 days ago. I thought I was going to need traction again." June snorted. "He's getting his strength back, and you grumpy old man are learning how to live again." Inside the house, the quiet was no longer hollow. The couch had become a shared den, the stove a sacred place of peace, and the table, once used only for lonely dinners, now held Wren's sketches, Gus's scattered treats, and June's clanging mug of too strong coffee. It felt like home, in the truest sense, messy, filled with uneven love, but real. Word of their courtroom victory had spread further than expected. Local papers ran headlines about the bear that refused to be silenced, and the ex-firefighter who took on a corporation for love. One article quoted Orion directly. "He saved me first." Donations came in sporadically, betting bear-appropriate food, even offers from animal therapists and old ranger friends who remembered Gus's original unit. But Orion turned most of it down. Gus didn't need a spotlight. He needed healing space, and above all, constancy, but healing didn't mean hiding. One sunny afternoon, they all ventured into town, Orion with his limp Gus, with a reinforced harness and soft-muzzled, just in case, June walking proudly with a donation flyer for wildlife recovery efforts, and Wren trailing behind with his sketch pad ready for anything. It was a test, and Gus passed. Children gasped, adults stared, but no one screamed. Gus's ears flicked at the noise, but he stayed close to Orion's side, his eyes scanning not for danger but for reassurance. A little girl approached with a stuffed bear in her arms. She held it out. "Is he the one from the news?" Orion knelt slowly. "Yeah, his name's Gus." She stepped forward, trembling but brave, and extended her mirror. "This is Marshmallow. He can be Gus's friend." Gus sniffed it gently, then gave it one slow lick. The girl laughed, and the town's fear cracked a little more. Back home, that laughter echoed like music. Orion hung the stuffed bear on a hook near the stove. "A badge of honor," he said, and Gus gave a low chuff in agreement. That night, Orion stood by the window while Ren and June played cards on the rug. The snow had melted enough to reveal patches of green beneath the frost. Spring was coming not just outside, but in Morrow. Called a week later, they shut Tear Shield down, he said over the crackling phone line. "Investigations going federal. Colton's being named in 3 ethics violations and 1 count of evidence tampering." Orion didn't gloat. He just said, "Good." For Morrow hung up, he added, "Give Gus a pat for me, tell him he's a damn hero." Orion did better than that. He cooked him a whole salmon and let him eat it right off the plate. "You earned it," he said, watching Gus devour it, licking every last shred of skin and scale with satisfied grunts. "You saved us all in your own way." Late that evening, Orion sat alone on the porch. Gus lay sprawled beside him, his head on Orion's boots. The stars were out clearer now, without the smoke of old fires clouding the sky. Ren's latest drawing sat beside Orion, a sketch of 4 figures under that same bare tree, but this time tiny buds had appeared on the branches. They were beginning to bloom. Orion looked at the picture, then at Gus, then at the house behind them, filled with warmth and voices and second chances. "Funny," he said softly, "thought I'd spend the rest of my life trying to forget everything that burned. But maybe I was just waiting for something worth saving." Gus shifted, pressing his side closer. His breath warmed through the fabric of Orion's pants. An Orion man of fire and scars whispered the truth. Not just to the cub, but to himself. "You saved me from the ashes." Across the street, a light flicked on. Ren's shadow passed by the window, and a moment later a new drawing appeared, taped gently to the glass for Orion to see. In it, a man and a bear stood in a field of green, surrounded by trees with leaves like flames, bright alive. Burning not with destruction, but with life. At the top, for the first time, Ren had added a sentence in careful handwriting. "No one walks through fire alone." Orion felt something rise in his chest, familiar. But softened by time, it didn't burn. It warmed. He turned to Gus and said, "Come on, let's go inside." And the bear rose steady on legs that once trembled and followed.